to another Throne of Thunder Raid Finder guide covering the halls of the Flesh Shaping. The first boss you will see is Duramu the Forgotten, a giant eyeball. Duramu easily wins the prize for causing most player deaths in all of the Throne of Thunder, and this is due to his Maze of Death, which I'll talk about in more detail later. The first and really only mechanic that tanks need to worry about is his hard stare. This will place a dot called arterial cut on the tank that is removed when the tank reaches full HP, so healers simply make sure the tank is topped off. He also applies a debuff called Serious Wound that reduces the healing receives, and this stacks, which requires a tank swap, so taunt off at about 5 stacks. Aside from navigating the death maze, which everyone must do, this is really all tanks need to know for the fight. As for other abilities that Duramu possesses, he will occasionally launch a missile called Lingering Gaze at a player that when it strikes, will leave a shadowy blob on the ground that simply should not be stood in. It is important for players to run as far as possible from the raid when this occurs, as placing too many of these too near the boss will make the maze phase much more difficult. He will also periodically hit players with an ability called Life Drain, a beam which will stun the player while Duramu sucks life from them. To reduce the damage dealt to the player and the healing that Duramu does to himself, another player needs to intercept the beam after a few seconds of a channeling. To do this, simply walk in between Duramu and the player who is currently targeted by the life drain. Finally, Duramu will also summon up 3 different colored cones of what appear to be fire coming out from his body. The blue and the red cones are locked onto 2 random players, and those players must run in a circle around Duramu until the blue and red flames reveal their different colored adds. The yellow cone is not locked onto a player and will simply move in a direction around Duramu. When any of these cones reveal their respective adds, you must DPS and burn the adds down as quickly as possible. And now to the Maze of Death. Duramu will begin casting an ability called Disintegration Beam, which takes a few seconds to charge up. And during this charge up, the easiest method I have found is to run and purposely stand in front of him in the beam. Don't worry, it doesn't do anything right off the bat. While standing in the beam and facing Duramu, look to your left and right. One side of Duramu will be covered in what looks like purple sparks all along the ground. This indicates the side where the safe zone will spawn. Once you know which side is safe, quickly move and stand there. Once Duramu's beam becomes active, it is a one-shot. You will die if caught by it. And to make matters worse, everywhere else on the entire map other than the safe zone, indicated by the sparks previously, will be covered in a purplish cloud of death. This will kill you rather quickly if you stand in it. Duramu, once his beam becomes active, will also begin to rotate towards you with the death beam. And as he rotates, the safe zone will also slowly move around the boss. Important to note is that the safe zone does not always move in a straight line. It will curve in and out and move around as it goes around the boss. The most important advice I can give is do not panic. It may look like the beam is going to catch you, but the safe zone will always stay ahead of it. Simply keep moving in the safe zone slowly around the boss. It is usually safer to stay closer to the purplish cloud than to the beam, as if you accidentally overshoot and walk into the cloud does not kill you immediately, which gives you time to quickly step back. The beam, however, is not as forgiving. Simply slowly move around Duramu and stay in the safe zone to your best of your ability. And remember, do not panic. After the beam phase ends, the fight resumes just as it started, and he begins using all of his other abilities again. Follow these mechanics and keep in the mist safe zone, and Duramu will go down. The second boss in the halls of Flesh Shaping is a mutated Sarok called Primordius. The main mechanic of this boss fight is gaining a buff called Fully Mutated that enables players to deal full damage to the boss. Players will need to kill small red slimes and then walk through the red puddles the slimes leave in their wake to gain a mutation. Once 5 mutations have been gained, they will become fully mutated. Do not touch any red puddles after becoming fully mutated, as this will only give harmful debuffs at this point. The slimes will also periodically drop purple puddles upon death, and these will only give harmful debuffs and should be avoided. The slimes themselves only move toward the boss and do not actually attack. The boss himself has a fair number of abilities, but for the most part, most of them are ignorable. The first ability he has is called Primordial Strike, and there's no real warning for this ability. It is simply a heavy damage hit and must be healed through. It is a frontal cone attack, so make sure no DPS are stacked on top of the tank at this point. Though due to its short range, it's not essential that the boss be faced away from ranged and healers. He will also stack a debuff on the tank called Malformed Blood. However, a tank swap will be performed before this debuff ever becomes a huge issue. Essentially, the way this boss fight works is one tank picks up the boss and moves him to the center of the room, while the other tank works on gaining his fully mutated buff. Upon gaining the buff, the mutated tank will then take the boss, while the other tank will then begin working on his fully mutated buff. Once the main tank's fully mutated buff begins to wear off, the other tank ensures that his buff is refreshed and takes the boss, and rinse and repeat. The best time to gain the fully mutated buff is while the boss's Malformed Blood debuff is still active, as it gives a substantial damage boost against the slimes. Right as everyone in the raid first gains their fully mutated buff, it's a very good time to Bloodlust and blow cooldowns and burn the boss as much as possible. Once Bloodlust wears off, the current tank needs to begin kiting the boss around the room. The reason for this is that as the red slimes reach the boss, they will mutate him gradually as well. Once enough reach him, he will mutate and gain a 10% increase in damage as well as additional abilities. This effect stacks. The boss will also mutate if he walks through any red or purple puddles from the slimes, so avoid this. These abilities are largely simply damage to be healed through. While some do not hit entirely lightly, they can be healed through in Raid Finder. If, due to gear or any other reason, you're uncomfortable with the number of Malformed Blood stacks, simply do a tank swap early. Up to around 8 stacks can be handled without too much difficulty, but if you do tank swap early, then you can make sure to call out for a Dispel from one of the healers. Dispelling will remove the fully mutated buff and any other mutations. The tank can then focus on refreshing the buff. Make sure to keep up the fully mutated buff and kite the boss steadily around the room, and Primordius dies without too much difficulty. The Dark Animus is the final boss in the Halls of the Flesh Shaping, and it can be a very easy boss fight. The method that makes this fight easy is quite simple. It requires restraint on the part of the DPS. When the fight first begins, the Dark Animus, that is, the blood-colored liquid orb in the middle of the room, will begin activating the small constructs. The easiest method is for one tank to round up the left side of the room and the other tank to gather up the right side of the room. Once the adds have been grouped up, it is important that they not be burned quickly. Instead, it is important that the adds be killed 1 or 2 at a time. DPS can, in fact, simply sit and wait, as the adds have very little HP, and the tanks alone can burn them one at a time rather quickly. Eventually, the room will run out of small constructs and large constructs will begin spawning. These do need to be burned down as quickly as possible. The reason the small constructs need to be killed slowly is so that you don't wind up with all the larges active at one time, as the anima from the small constructs, when killed, will jump to the larges, activating them. The large anima golems have an ability called Crimson Wake. Crimson Wake will target random raid members and shoot a moving column of fire at them that will damage them and everyone around them for a decent amount. With multiple wakes going at once, this can destroy a raid group quickly. Once enough golems are dead, the anima will begin jumping to the 2 massive anima golems. One tank needs to pick up both massives and kite them using a method I will describe in more detail later. Once enough of the constructs are dead, the boss will become active, and the tank not tanking the 2 massives needs to pick up him. The boss has 3 abilities that become usable depending on how much Dark Animus he has. The first ability he has automatically is an ability called Touch of Animus, which is simply a dot on a random player that must be healed through. The second ability he gains at about 25 Dark Anima is an ability called Anima Ring, which surrounds his current tank with multiple spheres of anima that, if they touch, will increase the damage they take by a large amount. To counter this, simply run sideways through as few of the spheres as possible, and be prepared for a small spike in damage taken. If you move quickly enough, you will touch only one sphere and the increase in damage taken will be small. The final ability the boss has at around 75 anima is called Interrupting Jolt, which is a cast time spell that hits the whole raid for a decent amount of damage and will interrupt any spells being cast at the time. The way the boss gains anima every so often is the boss will cast an ability called Siphon Anima, which takes 1 anima from all active constructs. This will eventually kill the 2 massive constructs. If the 2 massive constructs are killed early, all of their anima will immediately jump to the boss. Therefore, DPS needs to ignore the massives. The massives have 2 main abilities, which make for an interesting tanking encounter. One of which is Explosive Slam, which is a decent damaging hit that applies a debuff that increases the damage taken by further explosive slams. The other ability they have is called Matter Swap. This ability is used on a random player and causes them, when either it's dispelled or wears off, to swap places with the player furthest away from them. As this ability is used rather frequently, by kiting the mobs away from the raid group, the tank can ensure that he is always the one who swaps places with whomever received the debuff. This enables the tank to blink across the room, kiting the adds. Properly timed, this can even reset the Explosive Slam debuff. The most difficult phase of this fight is definitely getting all of the large anima golems down. Once that phase is complete, the fight goes rather simply, and the Dark Animus goes down. This concludes the Raid Finder Guide to Halls of the Flesh Shaping. I hope this helps, and thanks for watching.